All right, we're ready for 2nd and 3rd John. We have some ground to cover, so we're going to get underway. Just as a little housekeeping note, next Sunday, Rhodey will be with us. We will have Bible class. He will not be speaking at the Bible class hour. This was kind of an unplanned meeting, and consequently, we decided to go on with our Bible class program rather than have to crunch a little bit later. So we will have Bible class next week, and so if your children are involved in class, we are having all classes next Sunday. Say more about that a little bit later, about his coming. Some introductory things to 2nd John, and then we'll also stop when we get in with this to say some introductory things about 3rd John because they are distinct books. You've seen this quote before, and I like what King said. This is perhaps, these 3 epistles are the writings of an old warrior fighting what may have been his final battle. And from that viewpoint, these books can become quite interesting. Let's talk a little about some introductory things to 2nd John. Quickly just mention that John is the author. That's quite obvious. However, his name is not mentioned like Hebrews, and like 1 John, his name is not attached to the book. He calls himself the elder, not because he's an elder in the sense of the office of an elder, but he's an aged man. And I won't read the entire quotation, but King observes that he was so well known that he could refer to himself as the elder and be recognized as being none other than the Apostle John. I think perhaps King is correct in that. The writer here uses phrases and words that are found in 1 John, and several phrases very similar to that of 1 John. Some of the basic principles are repeated time and again, which makes us think this is the same author that we saw in 1 John. The church fathers credit, they don't mention 2 John specifically, and we'll say something about that in a second, but they talk about the epistles, plural, of John. Well, there's something then in addition to 1 John, because John, the Gospel of John, is not an epistle. 7 or 8 of the 13 verses are found in the first epistles. In other words, you can take the wording basically of 7 or 8 of these verses, which is a good portion of the book, and find basically the same phrase or a similar expression in 1 John. All of that argues for the fact that John probably is the writer. But one of the arguments against John being the author is there is little or no quotation from 2 John in the church fathers. And so one of the observations C.H. Dodd made is the fact that they are extremely short and contain very little matter for quotation. And because of that, that's why we now do not find those quotations among the church fathers. Now, who is the recipient? This is a major question in the letter. Doesn't really have a great deal of impact on the interpretation of the letter, except just who is the recipient. And the text says it is the elect lady and her children. And so the question is, does the elect lady refer to a church and its members or to some individual? And I take the fact that it's probably an individual and not a church as such. And here's some of the reason why. The general rule is that you take a word as literal when possible, unless there's something in the context that demands otherwise. She's called the elect lady, and she has children according to the text. And if it's a church, then I wonder who the children are. Well, that might be those in the church have helped obey the gospel. Okay, maybe so, but I still raise that question. It talks about your house, verse 10. And it talks in verse 13 about having a sister who also has children. Some may argue that's a sister congregation, and that has to do with, but it seems more likely that this has reference to an individual. So what do we know about this elect lady? Well, we really don't know much and about who she is. There is some question about her name. Her name may be Syria. And that's based off of the word for lady, which is simply the word for lady in Greek. And the meaning is simply lady. However, the American Standard footnote suggests perhaps this, or leaves the impression that this is thought maybe to be a name. We don't know. I'll leave that for you to decide. But we do know she was a faithful Christian. She had faithful children. She had a sister. She had nieces or nephews. And furthermore, her husband is either dead or he's not a Christian because he's not identified or mentioned here at all. But she does indeed have children. So we know a little about her. What about the date? This would have been a late date, perhaps 97 or later, late in the first century. We really don't know a great deal about the date. I'm more concerned about the message or the content. The message or the content has to do with walking in truth and abiding in truth. Notice these references, only 13 verses, verse 2, verse 4, verse 6, verse 9, use the expression of abiding in truth or abiding according to His commandments, walking in truth, abiding in the doctrine of Christ. It has to do with walking in the principles of truth. With that in mind, then the text is going to make some sense. It deals with love, like 1 John, and what it means. And furthermore, it warns about some false teachers, which 1 John had done the same thing. So this seems to be a letter written to a lady, an elect lady, a faithful Christian, warning her about the same kinds of things that 1 John in the general epistle had done as well. Now, what about the nature of the books? Woods observes that they are brief. That is, 2nd and 3rd John are brief. They're to the point. They're stripped of unnecessary verbiage. They're courteous, sympathetic, and obviously they are true. All right, I know that's a hurried look at that, but I think that's helpful to embark upon a study of these 13 verses. So let's look at 2nd John, and if you think we're going kind of hurried, because we want to get to 3rd John and talk about some things there. This is a survey, and that's what we're trying to do. I adapt this from Raymond Gingrich, and this is basically his outline, tweaked just a little bit. But I like the way he observed the structure of 2nd John. Calling it walking in truth, that verses 1 to 4 deals with abiding in truth is commended. Secondly, love and obedience is commanded. And then thirdly, fellowship with error is forbidden. That's just 13 verses, but that's packed full of information. So let's make our way through this and let's see what we can find. Let's start with this. The abiding in the truth, and here's the overall picture I want you to see when we work through verses 1 to 4. The theme has to do with walking in truth or abiding in truth, that's commended in this woman, and others who abide in the truth are appreciative of her, and we should rejoice in all who are walking in truth. So it's commended to walk in truth. Here's the first thing. There's love for one that is abiding in truth. Let's get verses 1 and 2. To the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, John, but also those who have known the truth. Now, the next word is important. Because of the truth which abides in us, which will be with us forever. What do you learn from verses 1 and 2? All right, we should walk in truth. John says, I love and I appreciate you. I'm going to paraphrase. You finish my sentence. I love and appreciate you because you walk in truth. This is not just affection because I like your personality. I like, you have a common interest that I have a common interest in. I like the way you handle things. I love you and I appreciate you because you walk in truth. And he said, it's not only me, but who else? All those who walk in truth. You learn something practical from that? Those who walk in truth love and appreciate others who walk in truth. Does that make sense? So why do you love and appreciate them? Because of their stand for truth and their abiding in truth and living according to truth. I may not know them well, but I love and appreciate the fact they abide in truth. And that's why I love them. And so he says, here's love for one that's abiding in truth. Now, verse 3. The one who abides in truth is blessed of God. We won't spend much time here. He mentions three things. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with you from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ in truth and love. And so here's grace, God's favor, mercy, His compassion, the peace, the result that comes from that. In other words, I think his point is, he's commending abiding in truth, that if you abide in truth, you have grace and mercy and peace. Here's a blessing. It's commendable to walk in truth. We love those who walk in truth, and God blesses those who walk in truth. Make sense? All right, let's get verse 4. What's his point at verse 4? He said, I greatly rejoice. Yeah, that your children walk in truth. Nearly every translation either says your children who walk in truth or some of your children or some equivalent to that. And so that raises the question, does that mean that some of her children were not walking in truth? And I'm not convinced that that conclusion is warranted. I might know someone, and I know they have 5 children, for example, and I know 2 of their children who walk in truth, but I don't know the other 3. So I know some of their children walk in truth. What do I know about the others? I don't know anything. I don't know that this implies she had some children not walking in truth. It may be. I'll leave that to you to decide. But here's the point. I rejoice that your children walk in truth. See, the idea is abiding in truth is commended. I love you for it. God's going to bless you for it. And I rejoice that you have children walking in truth. Here's something practical I learned from that. We ought to rejoice when others have children who walk in truth, whether our children are walking in truth or not. Does that make sense? I've known of some churches where there was church friction that I became convinced that this couple here, whose children turned out to the world, were jealous of this couple here, whose children were walking in truth. Can you see that? And so they constantly find fault, and they're bickering, and it's really nothing but jealousy that my children turned to the world, but yours are walking in truth. We ought to rejoice, whether my children walk in truth or not, that your children are walking in truth. Make sense? All right, let's move on. I know we're going quick. We may come back to those practical things later. Let's go to verses 5 and 6. Love and obedience is commanded. Love and obedience is commanded. So look at verse 5. I plead with you, lady, not as though I wrote a new commandment to you, but that which you have had from the beginning, that we should love one another. What does that sound like? I'm not asking what to interpret. What writing does that sound like? 1 John, yeah. 1 John. Sounds just like 1 John, doesn't it? It sounds like he's almost quoting from 1 John. If this is not John, whoever's writing this has read 1 John apparently, and is playing off of some of the concepts of 1 John. But be that as it may, he talks about loving one another. Let's go and get verse 6, and then we'll see what the text actually says. Now this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment that you've heard from the beginning, that you should walk in it. All right, let's talk about love and obedience. First of all, verse 5 says, here is a command. And what is the command? To love one another. This is agape, by the way. Seek the highest interest in others. This is not based on this warm feeling because of this close affection that we have, that friendship. But this is agape, seeking the highest interest, and we love them because they're abiding in truth, based on verses 1 to 4. Make sense? All right? Now, this is not new, but this is something from the beginning, he said, and I think that's from the beginning of their obedience to the gospel. Since you became Christians, you were taught to love your brethren. All right, now, verse 6 is interesting. Verse 6 focuses on obedience. What do you learn from verse 6 about obedience? All right? Love demands. This is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is love, that we walk according to his commandments. And this is the commandment that you've heard from the beginning. And so you ought to walk in it. So I think he's talking about obedience here. That we obey because we love God. We saw that in 1 John, didn't we? That's why we obey, is because we love God. We walk in the commandments because we love God. And thus, we obey this command to love. Now, I want you to notice a shift from plural to singular. And there's a point to be made from that. Did you notice in verse 5, I wrote a new commandment. Not as though I wrote a new commandment, but it's an old commandment. I wrote a commandment to you, singular. Then he says at verse 6, this is love that we walk according to his commandments, plural. And this is the commandment that you have, singular again. What do you learn from that? Here is a command, singular. Here's a command God's given us. Now, let's talk about a general principle. If we love God, we obey his commands, whatever those commands are. So if this is a command, conclusion, simple. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. We're going to obey it. That's all he's saying. That this is the love of God. This is love that we walk according to command. If you love God, you're going to do what he commands. You're going to obey all of his commandments. This is one of them. Could we insert some other command in there? Sure. The love of God means you obey his commands. Here's the command to worship. That means if I love God, I'm going to worship. Here's the command of God to forgive. Does that mean if I love God, I'm going to forgive? Yes, because that's a command. Here's the principle. Love of God means you obey the commands. Simple. Verses 5 and 6. All right. Love can be commanded. I mentioned that because this has been few in number, but I've had some brethren argue with me. You can't command love. Love is just something you do. It just comes natural. And if you don't love somebody or you don't love your mate, you can't command love. I beg to differ. This text says, this is the commandment I gave you, to love one another. Can you be commanded to love your children? Sure, Titus 2. Can you be commanded to love your wife? Sure, Ephesians 5. Can you be commanded to love your brethren? 2 John verse 5 and 6. Sure you can. And if we obey the commands, we'll obey all of them. All right, let's get the last section here before we go to 3 John. Fellowship with error is forbidden. So abiding in truth is commended. Love and obedience is commanded. Now fellowship with error is forbidden. We could not only spend the rest of our time, but we could spend a series of studies just on verses 9, 10, and 11. And time would forbid us to go in detail. So let's get the overview and the gist of this. What does verse 7 tell us? All right. Let's pause for a moment now and go back in memory. Don't have to turn back over there. But at 1 John, I'm going to come back to what Kevin just said. 1 John had talked about the Antichrist. How many Antichrists are there? There were many, he said. We define that as simply being against Christ, contrary to Christ. Now he's calling these the Antichrists. Look at verse 7. For there are many deceivers that are gone out into the world. Chapter 4 of 1 John said many false prophets are gone out into the world. And they do not confess that Jesus has come in the flesh. I think he's alluding to the principle of Gnostic thought, who denied the deity of Christ because all matter is evil. And so he said there are many deceivers. Among those are those that don't teach that Christ came in the flesh. They do not believe in the incarnation of the Son of God. They are deceivers and they're antichrists. In other words, they're false teachers out there. All right. Now what does verse 8 tell us? Because that principle is true, what do you need to do? Need to watch. Not look at first to other people, but you need to first of all look at yourself. Look at verse 8. Look to yourselves that we do not lose those things we've worked for. In other words, look to yourself. Make close self-examination. Because there are false teachers out there, you be aware and make sure that what you're hearing and what you're receiving is the truth. And be aware of the false teachers, be aware of the Antichrist, because you could easily lose what you've worked for and what we've worked toward. All right? Now then, look at verse 9. One who goes beyond the doctrine forfeits fellowship. Whoever transgresses, someone look up the American Standard so I don't have to do that. Somebody got a phone or a tablet? Raise your hand if you've got the American Standard. Say again. Who goes on ahead? All right, thank you. Who goes on ahead? Here is the idea of one going beyond, going on ahead of the doctrine of Christ, going outside the realm of the doctrine of Christ. Whoever transgresses or goeth onward or goes ahead does not abide in the doctrine of Christ, does not have God. But the one who abides in the doctrine of Christ, abiding in truth, remember verses 1 to 4, has both the Father and the Son. So if you go beyond and don't abide in the doctrine, you don't have God. You must abide within the doctrine to have fellowship with God. Here's abiding in truth, that theme again. So the one who goes outside the realm of the doctrine has forfeited fellowship. Now, I'm going to skip that in interest of time. So let's go to verses 10 and 11. What do you learn from verses 10 and 11? Absolutely. Don't receive that false teacher. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your house nor greet him. What does that mean? All right? Don't accept them. Don't have fellowship with them. Don't give them any endorsement. Don't bid them Godspeed. Now verse 11. The one who greets him, in the sense of verse 10, does what? Shares in his evil deeds. Now, I'm going to come back to that, verses 10 and 11 in a second. But this basically is a summary of what we just saw. There are many deceivers out there in the world. There's a lot of false doctrine. So here's what you need to do. Look at yourself. Make sure you're not being misled. Understand the one who goes beyond the doctrine of Christ has forfeited fellowship, and we're not to receive the false teacher. So error is going to be taught. Apostasy can be prevented, verse 8. Fellowship is forfeited, verse 9. And association should be denied, verses 10 and 11. Does that make sense? All right. I would agree with that. I think Revelation 22 is powerful, but if I couldn't deal with both passages, I would have to stick with this one because of the weight and the power and the clarity of this text. It's powerful. I want you to notice down at the bottom of this, we don't have time to deal with every point I'd like to make, but if you don't have a marginal note out beside your text, this would be a good time to make these 3 points. So that in the future, when someone comes along and raises a question, you can go back and look and say, let me see if this is what this text says. Here are those that are condemned in verses 9, 10, and 11. One who practices sin or error, verse 9. I think we pretty much agree with that. One who teaches error in verse 10, and one who receives the false teacher in verse 10 and 11. Let's illustrate. Let's suppose someone teaches that you can divorce your mate and remarry for any cause. And there are brethren who teach that. But suppose someone practices that. They divorce their mate. And you say, why did you get a divorce? Well, I didn't like her cooking. And so now I've married this other woman. They are practicing sin, are they not? Verse 9 says they're condemned. Here is a man who says, I see nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think that's what the Bible encourages, and he teaches that. Is he condemned? Verse 10. But I decide, even though I disagree with his error, I want to have him for a meeting and associate with him. And in fact, I want us to support him. Where do we fit? Verse 11. Does that make sense? The latter is happening all over the country among our brethren. The latter is happening. Where we reject the one practicing sin, we may even don't agree with the one teaching error, but we associate and we continue to have fellowship. All right. Then the conclusion is he has more to say to them, but he will not say more at the present. So walking in truth, abiding in truth is commended, love and obedience is commanded, and fellowship with error is forbidden. Make sense? All right, now we've got another book to go. Let's go to 3 John. Let's see if we can squeeze in some things about 3 John. The author is the same. He's referred to as the elder. Same reason, same purpose. But the recipient is different, and it's Gaius. Who is Gaius? We don't really know much more about Gaius than we knew about the elect lady. There are several in the New Testament by that name. There is one in Macedonia. There's a Macedonian who's involved in a riot, one who waited at Troas. Those are in Acts 19 and Acts 20. There was one at Corinth that was baptized by Paul. Was he any one of those, or was he some other Gaius? I don't know. What was his role in the church? Was he preaching there? Was he an elder there? Was he an influential member? The latter I know to be true. He seemed to be influential. But I do know this about him. He was faithful, he was hospitable, and he was not easily intimidated. I'm impressed with Gaius so far. If this is all the information I have about him, I'm impressed with Gaius. Something was going on in the church where there was a great deal of pressure to go against the grain of truth, and he stood the test. I'm impressed with Gaius. I wished we had more of those among us. Now, the date would be about the same time of the second letter. And so what's the message? It has to do with receiving faithful brethren. Now, here's the circumstance, and this will make sense as we work through the third letter. The circumstance seems to be that there were faithful brethren, perhaps preachers, that had come to the church where Gaius is a member. They were not received, but rather they were rejected by one who was there, whose name is Diotrephes, or referred to as Diotrephes. And any who received these brethren, accepted them, supported them, etc., were rejected by Diotrephes. However, Gaius went against the grain and received them. And so you see a man standing firm against pressure of a domineering force. Now, so here's what happens in 3 John. There's the encouragement to Gaius, the condemnation of Diotrephes, and there's praise for Demetrius. Demetrius is the third character mentioned here. So let's make our way through that. Let's talk about the encouragement to Gaius. What does he say about the... Well, he says, first of all, that he has love for Gaius. For what reason does he love him? Whom I love in truth. Now, verse 2 suggests that he had received a good report, verses 2 through 4, a good report about Gaius. Now, some question, and I'll throw it out for what it's worth, and you can chew on it and reject it, that he doesn't seem to be prosperous financially because they've concluded that. I'm not sure I draw that conclusion. And that he seems to be suffering some poor health. I'll leave you to draw that conclusion. I'm not sure about either one of those. But he may have been in poor health and not prospering. But he prays that he may prosper, that brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you, just as you walk in truth. I have no greater joy than to hear my children walk in truth. So I love you for the truth's sake. I got a good report that you're walking in truth. Some brethren came and told me about you. Here's what you did, verses 5 to 8. What did he do? He did some things for his brethren and who have borne witness to of your love before the church. If you send them forward on this journey, in what manner worthy of God you do well, because they went forth for his name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. In other words, I take from that there were some preachers who went forth preaching among the Gentiles, and they're not being paid by the Gentiles. And so that's not where they're getting their support. And Diotrephes wouldn't accept them, wouldn't support them, but you did. You sent them on their journey. You helped them with their support. You helped encourage them, but you seem to have helped them financially. I take from verse 7, we ought to receive such that we may become fellow workers for the truth. Now, what do you take from that phrase, that we may become fellow workers for the truth? Absolutely. Let's just take some of the men we support. You take your money out of your pocket and you put it into the collection plate. And then we support, for example, next week we'll have Brother Gumpad here, and we support him. And so sometimes people say, well, the elders are sending him support. It's not from the elders. It's from the whole church, which means you're having fellowship with him. Do you see that point? You're having fellowship with him. So when you help him, and you may do that on an individual basis. You may give somebody some money in the preaching of the gospel, and you become a fellow worker for the truth. You're trying to support them, and that's what Gaius did. Gaius had accepted them even in against the grain, as we've already talked about. So he's encouraging Gaius. I love you because you stand for truth. I got a good report. You received and you supported people who are working in the truth. Now there's the condemnation of Diotrephes. What do we know about Diotrephes? He wanted to be first. He loved to have the preeminence. Look at verse 9. Look at verse 9. He said, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, did not receive us. Not only did he not receive these teachers, but he didn't receive us. Yeah, didn't even receive the apostles. Yeah, good point. Rejected them. Because he loved, what I want you to see first of all is he loved to have the preeminence. In other words, here is a domineering force who focuses only on himself and thinks only about himself, and it's going to be his way or no way. You ever seen that? Ever dealt with that in the church? I've seen that many times. That it's going to be my way or it's not going to be any way at all. And so this domineering, overpowering force, that's the way Diotrephes was. Good point. No, he didn't acknowledge the authority of the apostles. It doesn't matter that they are in authority or that they were apostles. They rejected them because it didn't fit with his own thinking. Good point. Now notice at verse 10. Verse 10. I will call to mind when I come. I'll call to mind what he does, prating against us. Let's talk about that word prating. It means it's emptiness. In other words, he was making malicious statements against the apostles for which there is no basis. And so it's unfounded charges is the idea. And so look up BDAG and other authorities, and they basically say it's an empty charge, malicious charge. So he's saying things about the apostles and other teachers of truth, and it's empty charges that are being uttered. And that's what he's saying. He's prating against us. Now, verse 10b, not only would he not accept, but what did he do? Absolutely. So when somebody else would want to accept the apostles or these teachers of truth, then he put pressure on them, even trying to put some out of the church. If you're not going to go along, then you've got to get out. But Gaius is standing the pressure. I've always been impressed with Gaius, but I think this time cycle through, I'm seeing more clearly than I've ever seen before that Gaius is having to stand against the pressure of Diotrephes. We always focus on Diotrephes, but think about Gaius standing against that pressure. How he had to stand strong against someone who's domineering, trying to push other people out. You just got to get out if you're not going to go along with me. Well, look at verse 10. First part of verse 10. What did John say I'm going to do when I come? I plan to come. I'm going to... I'm going to deal with him when I come. I'm going to deal with him. All right, let's talk about Demetrius. Now, we haven't talked about him so far, other than just mentioning him in our outline. So his letter is encouraging to Gaius for his stand. Here's the condemnation of Diotrephes for rejecting those in authority and rejecting teachers of truth. But there's praise for Demetrius. Now, what do we learn about Demetrius at verse 11? All right. Yeah, notice, here's the general principle at verse 11 through which he makes an application at verse 12. Do not imitate what is evil. In other words, we've got two examples set before us here already. And here's Gaius and here's Diotrephes. Don't imitate the evil, Diotrephes, but imitate that which is good. So go back to verse 11. Do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He that is good is of God, but he that does evil has not seen God. Diotrephes hasn't seen God. He doesn't know God. He's not in a relationship with God. But Gaius is. So imitate what's good. Let me give you an example now. Look at verse 12. Demetrius has a good testimony from all and from the truth itself. And we also bear witness and know that our testimony is true. In other words, Demetrius follows the good example. He's to be commended. Who is he? I don't know much about him, but I know this much, that the testimony of all who know him, they say good things about him. Even truth itself commends him, and the apostles themselves commend him. He's to be praised for his stand for truth. Make sense? Now then, we have the conclusion at verses 13 and 14, which is basically similar to what we saw in 2 John. I have many more things to write, but I do not wish to write them with pen and ink. And I hope to see you shortly. Speak face-to-face peace to you. Our friends greet you. You greet the friends by name. And that's the end of 3 John. Questions or comments? Good point. Good point. Good point. Anything else practical you take home with you? Good parallel. John 12 is good parallel. Good. Anything else? We're through with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. This is the books that we spent during our hermeneutics class reading 50 times. I hope that reading has enhanced your appreciation and understanding for this abiding in truth. It's repeated over and over in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Jude next time, the book of Jude.